This is the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka.
Kafka wrote it in about 3 weeks at the end of 1912 at night while he worked full days at an insurance office he hated. You know the first line, even if you have never read the book. A man wakes up from bad dreams and finds that he is no longer a man. What you may not know is that Kafka never says what he turned into. When his publisher wanted to draw it, he wrote back that the creature must not be drawn. Not even from a distance, he said. So he did not draw it either. You will not see it in this video, and that was his instruction, not our idea. What you are about to hear is a new English translation made for this channel from the original German. It was not taken from anyone else's version. There is one thing I want you to listen for, and it is not the insect. Listen for the sister. She is the only one who takes care of him at the start. Watch for the exact moment when she changes her mind. That moment is what the book is really about. It begins now.
Part 1. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself in his bed, transformed into a monstrous vermin. He lay on his back, which was hard as armor, and when he lifted his head a little he saw his belly, domed and brown, and divided into stiff arched sections, on top of which the blanket, ready to slide off altogether, could barely hold its place. His many legs, pitifully thin compared to the rest of him, flickered helplessly before his eyes. "What has happened to me?" he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only a little too small, lay quiet between its 4 familiar walls. Above the table, where a sample case of cloth had been unpacked and spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman. Hung the picture he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a short while ago, and set in a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady sitting upright, wearing a fur hat and a fur bow, holding out to the viewer a heavy fur muff into which her whole forearm had disappeared. Gregor's eyes turned to the window, and the dull weather, he could hear raindrops striking the metal sill, made him feel quite melancholy. What if I slept a little longer and forgot all this foolishness? He thought. But that was completely impossible, because he was used to sleeping on his right side. And in his present state, he could not get himself into that position. However hard he threw himself onto his right side, he rocked back onto his back every time. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so that he would not have to see his squirming legs. And he only gave up when he began to feel a faint, dull ache in his side that he had never felt before. God in heaven, he thought, what an exhausting profession I have chosen. Day in, day out, on the road. The strain of the business is far greater out here than it is at the office at home. And on top of that I am saddled with the misery of traveling, the worry about train connections, the bad and irregular meals, and human company that is always changing, never lasting, never becoming warm. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itch on his belly. He pushed himself slowly on his back towards the bedpost so that he could lift his head better, found the itching place, which was covered with small white spots that he could not make sense of, and went to touch the spot with one leg. but pulled it straight back, because at the contact a cold shiver ran through him. He slid back into his earlier position. This getting up early, he thought, makes a man an idiot. A man has to have his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like women in a harem. When I go back to the inn in the middle of the morning to write up the orders I have taken, those gentlemen are only just sitting down to breakfast. I should try that with my chief. I would be thrown out on the spot. Who knows, though, whether that would not be very good for me. If I were not holding back for my parents' sake, I would have given notice long ago. I would have walked straight up to the chief and told him what I think, from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen off his desk. It is a strange way to do things, to sit up on the desk and talk down from that height at an employee who has to come right up close because the chief is hard of hearing. Well, I have not given up hope entirely. Once I have the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, and that should take another 5 or 6 years, I will do it without fail. Then I will make the great break. For now, though, I have to get up, because my train leaves at 5. And he looked over at the alarm clock, ticking on the chest of drawers. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were moving quietly forward. It was even past the half hour. It was already getting on for 6:45. Could the alarm not have gone off? From the bed, he could see that it was set correctly for 4 o'clock. It must have gone off. Yes, but was it possible to sleep quietly through that furniture-shaking ring? Well, he had not slept quietly, but probably all the more deeply for that. What should he do now? The next train left at 7. To catch it, he would have to hurry like a madman, and the sample case was not packed, and he himself did not feel especially fresh or ready to move. And even if he caught the train, there was no avoiding a storm from the chief, because the office porter had waited at the 5 o'clock train and would long since have reported that he had failed to appear. He was a creature of the chief's, with no backbone and no sense. What if he reported in sick? But that would be extremely awkward and would look suspicious, because in 5 years of service Gregor had not been ill once. The chief would certainly come, with the doctor from the health insurance, would reproach his parents for their lazy son, and cut off every objection by pointing to that doctor, for whom there are no sick people in the world at all, only people who are perfectly healthy and afraid of work. And would he be so very wrong in this case? Gregor did in fact feel quite well, apart from a drowsiness that was really unnecessary after such a long sleep, and he was even particularly hungry. While he was turning all this over in the greatest haste, without being able to bring himself to leave the bed, and just as the clock struck 7:15, there was a careful knock at the door by the head of his bed. Gregor, a voice called. It was his mother. It is 7:15. Didn't you want to catch your train? That gentle voice. Gregor was frightened when he heard his own voice answering. It was unmistakably his old voice, but mixed into it, as if from underneath, was a painful squeaking that could not be held down, which left the words clear only for the first moment and then destroyed them in the echo, so that you could not be sure you had heard them right. Gregor had meant to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he limited himself to saying, "Yes, yes, thank you, Mother. I am getting up now." Through the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was probably not noticeable outside, because his mother was satisfied with this and shuffled away. But the short exchange had made the rest of the family aware that Gregor was still at home, against all expectation, and already his father was knocking at one of the side doors, weakly, but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called, "what is going on?" And after a little while he urged him again in a deeper voice, "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door his sister was quietly lamenting Gregor. "Are you unwell? Do you need anything?" Gregor answered towards both sides at once, "I am ready now." And he took pains to remove everything unusual from his voice by pronouncing with the greatest care and putting long pauses between the individual words. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg you." Gregor had no intention of opening it, and instead praised the habit he had picked up from traveling, of locking every door at night, even at home. First he wanted to get up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, and above all have breakfast, and only then think about what came next. Because he could see clearly that in bed he would never think his way to a sensible conclusion. He remembered that he had often felt some slight pain in bed, brought on perhaps by lying awkwardly, which then turned out to be pure imagination once he stood up. And he was curious to see how today's notions would gradually dissolve. That the change in his voice was nothing but the first sign of a proper chill, an occupational illness of traveling salesmen, he did not doubt in the least. Throwing off the blanket was quite simple. He only had to puff himself up a little, and it fell by itself. But after that it became difficult, above all because he was so uncommonly wide. He would have needed arms and hands to raise himself up. Instead, he had only the many little legs, which never stopped moving in every direction, and which he could not control. If he wanted to bend one of them, it was the first to stretch out, and if he finally managed to do what he wanted with that leg, all the others meanwhile worked away, as if set free, in the highest and most painful agitation. "Just don't lie about uselessly in bed," Gregor said to himself. First he wanted to get the lower part of his body out of the bed. But this lower part, which he had not yet seen, and could form no clear picture of, turned out to be too hard to move. It went so slowly. And when at last, almost wild with impatience, he gathered all his strength and pushed himself forward without caring what happened. He had chosen the wrong direction. Struck the lower bedpost hard, and the burning pain he felt taught him that the lower part of his body was, at the moment, perhaps the most sensitive. So he tried to get the upper part of his body out of the bed first and carefully turned his head towards the edge. This he managed easily, and in spite of its width and weight, the mass of his body slowly followed the turn of his head. But when at last he held his head outside the bed, in the open air, he became afraid to go on pushing forward this way. Because if he finally let himself fall like that, it would take a miracle for his head not to be injured. And he could not afford to lose consciousness now, of all times. He would rather stay in bed. But when, after the same effort, he lay there sighing as before, and saw his little legs fighting against one another, perhaps even worse than before, and found no way to bring quiet and order into that chaos, he told himself again that he could not possibly stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing was to risk everything. If there was even the smallest hope of freeing himself from the bed that way. At the same time, he did not forget to remind himself, now and then, that calm, the calmest possible reflection, is far better than desperate decisions. At such moments, he fixed his eyes as sharply as he could on the window. But unfortunately, there was little confidence or cheer to be got from the sight of the morning fog, which hid even the other side of the narrow street. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself as the clock struck again. 7 o'clock already, and still such a fog. And for a little while he lay quietly, breathing weakly, as if he expected the complete stillness to bring back the real and ordinary state of things. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I absolutely must be completely out of this bed. Besides, by then someone from the firm will have come to ask after me, because the office opens before 7. And he set about rocking the whole length of his body out of the bed evenly. If he let himself fall out of the bed this way, his head, which he meant to lift sharply during the fall, would probably not be injured. His back seemed to be hard, and nothing would happen to it in a fall onto the carpet. What worried him most was the thought of the loud crash there would have to be, which would probably cause, behind every door, if not alarm, then at least concern. But it had to be risked. When Gregor was already half out of the bed, and the new method was more a game than an effort, he only had to rock himself in jerks. It occurred to him how simple all this would be if someone came to help. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would have been quite enough. They would only have had to push their arms under his domed back, lever him out of the bed, bend down with the load, and then simply wait patiently while he swung himself over onto the floor, where his little legs would hopefully find some purpose. Well, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked. Should he really have called for help? In spite of all his trouble, he could not hold back a smile at the thought. He had already got so far that, with a stronger rock, he could hardly keep his balance, and very soon he would have to decide for good. Because it was 5 minutes to 7:15 when the doorbell rang. "That is someone from the firm," he said to himself, and almost froze, while his little legs only danced the faster. For a moment, everything was still. "They are not opening," Gregor said to himself, caught up in some senseless hope. But then, of course, the maid went to the door, with her firm step, as always, and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first word of greeting to know who it was: the chief clerk himself. Why was Gregor condemned to serve a firm where the smallest lapse at once aroused the greatest suspicion? Were all employees, without exception, scoundrels? Was there not one loyal and devoted man among them who, if he failed to use even a couple of morning hours for the business, went mad with a bad conscience and was simply unable to leave his bed? Was it really not enough to send an apprentice to ask, if this asking was necessary at all? Did the chief clerk himself have to come? And did the whole innocent family have to be shown that the investigation of this suspicious business could be entrusted only to the intelligence of the chief clerk? And more, because of the agitation these thoughts produced in him, than through any real decision. Gregor swung himself out of the bed with all his might. There was a loud thud, but it was not really a crash. The fall was softened a little by the carpet, and his back was more elastic than Gregor had thought. So the dull sound was not so striking after all. Only he had not held his head carefully enough, and had struck it. He turned it and rubbed it against the carpet in annoyance and pain. "Something fell in there," said the chief clerk in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something like what had happened to him today might not one day happen to the chief clerk too. You really had to grant that it was possible. But, as if in rough answer to this question, the chief clerk now took a few firm steps in the next room and made his patent leather boots creak. From the room on the right his sister whispered, to let Gregor know, "Gregor, the chief clerk is here." "I know," Gregor said to himself. But he did not dare raise his voice loud enough for his sister to hear. "Gregor," his father said now from the room on the left, "the chief clerk has come and wants to know why you did not leave on the early train. We do not know what to tell him. Besides, he wants to speak to you personally. So please open the door. He will be good enough to excuse the untidiness of the room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk called in kindly at this point. "He is not well," his mother said to the chief clerk, while his father went on talking at the door. "He is not well, believe me, sir." Why else would Gregor miss a train? The boy has nothing in his head but the business. "It almost annoys me that he never goes out in the evening. He has been in town a whole week now, and he was at home every single evening. He sits there with us at the table and quietly reads the paper or studies timetables. It is already an entertainment for him when he busies himself with his fretsaw. Over 2 or 3 evenings, for instance, he carved a little frame. You would be amazed how pretty it is. It is hanging in there in his room. You will see it as soon as Gregor opens the door. I am glad you are here, by the way, sir. On our own, we would never have got Gregor to open the door. He is so stubborn. And he is certainly not well, though he denied it this morning. I am coming, said Gregor slowly and carefully, and did not move, so as not to miss a word of the conversation. I cannot explain it any other way myself, madam, said the chief clerk. Let us hope it is nothing serious. Though, on the other hand, I must say that we businessmen, fortunately or unfortunately as you like, very often simply have to get over a slight indisposition for the sake of the business. So can the chief clerk come in to you now? Asked his father impatiently, knocking at the door again. No, said Gregor. In the room on the left an awkward silence fell, and in the room on the right his sister began to sob. Why did his sister not go and join the others? She had probably only just got out of bed and had not begun to dress yet. And why was she crying? Because he would not get up and let the chief clerk in. Because he was in danger of losing his post. And because then the chief would start hounding his parents about the old debts again. Those were surely unnecessary worries for the moment. Gregor was still here and had not the slightest intention of leaving his family. At this instant he was lying on the carpet, and nobody who knew his condition would seriously have demanded that he let the chief clerk in. But surely Gregor could not simply be dismissed on the spot for this small discourtesy, for which a suitable excuse would easily be found later. And it seemed to Gregor that it would be far more sensible to leave him in peace now than to disturb him with crying and persuasion. But it was precisely the uncertainty that was pressing on the others and excused the way they behaved. Mr. Samsa, the chief clerk now called, raising his voice, "What is the matter?" You barricade yourself in your room. You answer only yes and no. You cause your parents serious and unnecessary worry. And you neglect, I mention this only in passing, your duties to the firm in a way that is frankly outrageous. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and of your chief, and I ask you in all seriousness for an immediate and clear explanation. I am astonished. Astonished. I thought I knew you as a quiet, sensible man, and now you suddenly seem to want to start parading strange moods. The chief did suggest to me this morning a possible explanation for your absence. It concerned the money you were recently entrusted to collect. But I practically gave my word of honor that this explanation could not be right. Now, however, I see your incomprehensible obstinacy here, and I lose every desire to speak up for you in the slightest. And your position is not the most secure. I originally intended to say all this to you in private, but since you are letting me waste my time here for nothing, I see no reason why your parents should not hear it too. Your performance recently has been very unsatisfactory. It is not the season for exceptional business, we recognize that. But a season for doing no business at all does not exist, Mr. Samsa, and must not exist. But, sir, Gregor cried, beside himself, forgetting everything else in his agitation, I am opening the door right now, this instant. A slight indisposition, a dizzy spell, has kept me from getting up. I am still lying in bed. But I am quite fresh again now. I am just getting out of bed. One small moment of patience. It is not going as well as I thought, but I am already feeling better. How something like this can come over a man. Only last night I was perfectly well. My parents know that, or rather, last night I did have a small warning of it. They must have seen it in me. Why did I not report it to the office? But you always think you will get over an illness without staying at home. Sir, spare my parents. There is no ground for any of the reproaches you are making to me now. Nobody has said a word to me about any of it. Perhaps you have not read the last orders I sent in. In any case, I shall still leave on the 8 o'clock train. These few hours of rest have given me strength. Do not hold yourself up, sir. I shall be at the office myself directly, and please be good enough to say so, and to give my respects to the chief. And, while Gregor was blurting all this out, hardly knowing what he was saying, he had moved easily over to the chest of drawers. No doubt, because of the practice he had already got in bed, and was now trying to raise himself up against it. He really did want to open the door, really wanted to show himself, and speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to know what the others, who were demanding him so insistently now, would say at the sight of him. If they were horrified, then Gregor had no more responsibility and could be at peace. But if they took it all calmly, then he had no reason to be upset either. And if he hurried, he could really be at the station by 8. At first he slid off the smooth chest of drawers several times. But at last he gave himself one final swing and stood upright. He no longer paid any attention to the pain in his abdomen, however much it burned. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and held onto its edges with his little legs. With that he had gained control of himself, and he fell silent, because now he could listen to the chief clerk. Did you understand a single word of that? The chief clerk asked the parents. He is not making fools of us, surely. For God's sake, cried the mother, already in tears. Perhaps he is seriously ill, and here we are tormenting him. Greta. Greta, she then shouted. Mother. His sister called from the other side. They were speaking to each other through Gregor's room. You must go to the doctor at once. Gregor is ill. Quick, fetch the doctor. Did you hear Gregor speaking just now? That was an animal's voice, said the chief clerk, strikingly quiet against the mother's shouting. Anna. Anna, the father called through the hall into the kitchen, clapping his hands. Fetch a locksmith, now. And already the two girls were running through the hall with their skirts rustling. How had his sister dressed so quickly? And pulling open the front door. There was no sound of the door closing. They had probably left it open, as people do in a home where some great misfortune has happened. Gregor, however, had become much calmer. So his words were no longer understood, even though they had seemed clear enough to him, clearer than before, perhaps because his ear had grown used to them. But at least they now believed that something was not right with him, and were ready to help. The confidence and firmness with which the first arrangements had been made did him good. He felt drawn back into the circle of human beings, and he hoped for great and surprising results from both of them, from the doctor and from the locksmith, without really telling the two apart. To get his voice as clear as possible for the decisive conversations that were coming, he coughed a little, taking care to do it very softly, since even this noise might sound different from a human cough, and he no longer trusted himself to judge that. Meanwhile, it had gone completely quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table with the chief clerk and whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Gregor pushed himself slowly towards the door with the chair, let go of it there, threw himself against the door, and held himself upright against it. The pads of his little legs had some stickiness to them, and rested there a moment from the effort. Then he set about turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed, unfortunately, that he had no real teeth. What was he to grip the key with? But his jaws were certainly very strong, and with their help, he really did get the key moving, and paid no attention to the fact that he was undoubtedly doing himself some harm, because a brown fluid came out of his mouth, ran over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Just listen," said the chief clerk in the next room. "He is turning the key." That was a great encouragement to Gregor. But they should all have called out to him, his father and mother too. "Go on, Gregor," they should have called. "Keep at it, hold on to that lock," and imagining that they were all following his efforts with excitement. He clamped his jaws on the key with everything he had, senseless with the strain. As the key turned, he danced around the lock, holding himself upright now, by his mouth alone, and hanging from the key, or pressing it down again, with the whole weight of his body, as the moment required. The brighter click of the lock, finally springing back, woke Gregor up, as it were. Breathing out, he said to himself, "So I did not need the locksmith after all." And he laid his head on the handle to open the door completely. Since he had to open the door in this way, it was in fact already quite wide open, while he himself still could not be seen. He had first to turn slowly around one wing of the door, and very carefully at that, if he did not want to fall flat on his back just as he entered the room. He was still busy with that difficult movement and had no time to notice anything else, when he heard the chief clerk let out a loud "oh." It sounded like the wind rushing. And now he saw him too, standing nearest the door, pressing his hand against his open mouth and slowly backing away, as though driven by some invisible force that pushed at him steadily. His mother, who was standing there in spite of the chief clerk's presence, with her hair still down from the night and sticking up on end, first looked at his father with her hands folded, then took 2 steps towards Gregor and sank down in the middle of her skirts as they spread out around her, her face lost entirely against her breast. His father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wanted to push Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, then covered his eyes with his hands and wept until his great chest shook. Gregor did not enter the room at all now, but leaned against the inside of the bolted wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible, and above it his head tilted to one side, with which he peered over at the others. Meanwhile, it had grown much lighter. Across the street a section of the endless, gray-black building opposite stood out clearly. It was a hospital, with its regular windows cutting harshly into the front. The rain was still falling, but only in large drops, visible one by one, and thrown down onto the ground one by one as well. The breakfast dishes stood on the table in great number, because breakfast was the most important meal of the day for his father, and he would draw it out for hours over various newspapers. On the wall, directly opposite, hung a photograph of Gregor from his time in the army, showing him as a lieutenant, his hand on his sword, smiling without a care, demanding respect for his bearing and his uniform. The door to the hall was open, and since the front door of the flat was open too, one could see out onto the landing and the top of the stairs going down. "Well," said Gregor, fully aware that he was the only one who had kept calm, "I shall get dressed at once, pack up the samples, and be on my way. Will you let me go? Now, sir, you see that I am not stubborn and that I like my work. Traveling is hard, but I could not live without traveling. Where are you going, sir? To the office. Yes? Will you report everything truthfully? A man can be temporarily unfit for work, but that is exactly the right moment to remember his earlier record, and to consider that later. Once the obstacle has been removed, he will certainly work all the harder and with all the more concentration. I am so deeply obliged to the chief, as you know perfectly well. On the other hand, I have my parents and my sister to think of. I am in a tight place, but I shall work my way out of it again. Only do not make it harder for me than it already is. Take my side at the office. Nobody likes the traveling salesman. I know that. People think he earns a fortune and leads a fine life on top of it. They simply have no particular reason to think that prejudice through. But you, sir, you have a better view of the situation than the rest of the staff, indeed. And I say this in complete confidence, a better view than the chief himself, who in his position as owner is easily led into judging an employee unfairly. You also know very well that the traveling salesman, who is out of the office almost the whole year round, can so easily fall victim to gossip, to accidents, and to groundless complaints, against which it is quite impossible for him to defend himself, since he usually hears nothing at all about them, and only when he has finished a journey, exhausted, does he feel the bad consequences in his own body at home, without being able to trace them back to their causes any more. Sir, do not go away without saying a word to show me that you think I am right in at least some small part of this. But the chief clerk had turned away at Gregor's first words, and only looked back at Gregor over his twitching shoulder, with his lips drawn back. And during Gregor's speech, he did not stand still for a moment, but withdrew towards the door without taking his eyes off Gregor, though very gradually, as if there were some secret prohibition against leaving the room. He was already in the hall, and from the sudden movement with which he drew his foot out of the living room, for the last time, you might have believed he had just burned the soul of it. In the hall, though, he stretched his right hand far out towards the staircase, as if some downright unearthly deliverance were waiting for him there. Gregor saw that he must on no account let the chief clerk go away in this mood, if his position at the firm was not to be put in the gravest danger. His parents did not understand all this so well. Over the long years, they had formed the conviction that Gregor was set up for life in this firm, and besides, they were so taken up with their immediate worries now that they had lost all foresight. But Gregor had that foresight. The chief clerk had to be held back, calmed, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister had been there. She was clever. She had already been crying while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And the chief clerk, that friend of the ladies, would certainly have let her steer him. She would have shut the front door and talked him out of his fright in the hall. But his sister was not there, and Gregor had to act himself. And without stopping to think that he did not yet know what he was now capable of by way of movement, and without stopping to think that his speech had possibly, indeed probably, not been understood again, he let go of the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and set out towards the chief clerk, who was already clinging ridiculously to the banister of the landing with both hands. But at once, groping for support, Gregor fell down with a small cry onto his many little legs. Hardly had this happened when he felt, for the first time that morning, a physical sense of well-being. His little legs had firm ground beneath them. They obeyed him completely, as he noticed with joy. They even strove to carry him wherever he wanted to go. And already he believed that the final relief from all his suffering was at hand. But at that very moment, as he lay there on the floor, rocking with held-back movement, not far from his mother, and directly opposite her, she, who had seemed so completely sunk into herself, sprang up all at once, her arms stretched wide, her fingers spread, and cried, "Help! For God's sake, help!" She held her head bent, as if to see Gregor better, but ran senselessly backwards instead. She had forgotten that the laid table stood behind her, and when she reached it, she sat down on it hastily, as if absent-minded, and did not seem to notice at all that beside her the coffee was pouring in a full stream out of the overturned pot onto the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor quietly, and looked up at her. For a moment the chief clerk had gone completely out of his mind. On the other hand, he could not stop himself, at the sight of the flowing coffee, from snapping his jaws several times at the empty air. At that his mother screamed again, fled from the table, and fell into the arms of his father, who was rushing towards her. But Gregor had no time for his parents now. The chief clerk was already on the stairs. With his chin on the banister, he looked back one last time. Gregor took a run at it, to be as sure as possible of catching him. The chief clerk must have sensed something, because he jumped down several steps at once and disappeared. He still cried out a "huh," and it rang through the whole stairwell. Unfortunately, this flight of the chief clerk's now seemed to confuse his father completely, who until then had been relatively composed, because instead of running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in the chase, he seized in his right hand the chief clerk's walking stick, which had been left behind on a chair with his hat and overcoat, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left hand, and set about driving Gregor back into his room by stamping his feet and waving the stick and the newspaper. No pleading from Gregor helped, and no pleading was understood. However humbly he turned his head, his father only stamped his feet harder. Across the room, his mother had thrown open a window, in spite of the cold weather, and was leaning out with her face pressed into her hands far outside it. A strong draught arose between the street and the stairwell. The window curtains flew up. The newspapers on the table rustled. Single sheets blew across the floor. His father pressed on without mercy, hissing like a savage. But Gregor had no practice at all yet in going backwards, and it was really very slow. If only Gregor had been allowed to turn round, he would have been in his room at once. But he was afraid of making his father impatient with the time the turn would take. And at any moment, the stick in his father's hand threatened him with a fatal blow on the back, or the head. In the end, though, Gregor had no choice, because he noticed with horror that going backwards, he could not even keep to a direction. And so he began, with unceasing frightened glances sideways at his father, to turn himself round as quickly as he could, which in reality was very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his goodwill, because he did not disturb him in this, and even directed the turning movement here and there from a distance with the tip of his stick. If only there had not been that unbearable hissing from his father. It made Gregor lose his head completely. He had almost turned all the way round when, still listening to that hissing, he made a mistake and turned part of the way back again. But when at last he had his head happily in front of the doorway, it turned out that his body was too wide to get through without more ado. It did not occur to his father, of course, in his present state, to open the other wing of the door and make a passage wide enough for Gregor. His one fixed idea was that Gregor had to get into his room as fast as possible. Nor would he ever have allowed the elaborate preparations. Gregor needed to raise himself up, and perhaps get through the door that way. Instead, he drove Gregor forward, now with a special uproar, as if there were no obstacle at all. What came from behind Gregor no longer sounded like the voice of a single father. Now, it really was no joke anymore, and Gregor forced himself into the doorway, come what might. One side of his body lifted, he lay at an angle in the opening. One of his flanks was rubbed raw. Ugly stains were left on the white door. And soon he was stuck fast and could not have moved on his own at all. The little legs on one side hung trembling in the air. Those on the other were pressed painfully to the floor. Then his father gave him from behind a strong push that was now truly a deliverance, and he flew far into his room, bleeding heavily. The door was slammed shut with the stick, and then at last it was quiet. Part 2. Only at dusk did Gregor wake from his heavy, faint-like sleep. He would certainly have woken not much later, even without being disturbed, because he felt sufficiently rested and slept out. But it seemed to him that a hurried step and a careful closing of the door to the hall had woken him. The glow of the electric street lamps lay pale here and there on the ceiling and on the upper parts of the furniture, but down where Gregor was it was dark. Slowly, still groping clumsily with his feelers, which he was only now learning to value, he pushed himself towards the door to see what had happened there. His left side felt like one long, unpleasantly tightening scar, and he had to limp properly on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been badly injured in the course of the morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been hurt, and it dragged along behind him lifelessly. Only at the door did he notice what had really drawn him there. It had been the smell of something to eat. For there stood a bowl filled with sweet milk, with small slices of white bread floating in it. He could almost have laughed with joy, because he was even hungrier than in the morning. And at once he dipped his head into the milk, almost past his eyes. But he soon drew it back again in disappointment. Not only did eating give him trouble, because of his tender left side, and he could only eat if his whole body worked at it, snorting, but the milk, which had always been his favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly put there for that reason, did not taste good to him at all. He turned away from the bowl, almost with disgust, and crawled back into the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack of the door, the gas had been lit. But whereas at this time of day his father usually read the afternoon paper aloud to his mother, and sometimes to his sister as well, in a raised voice, not a sound could be heard now. Well, perhaps this reading aloud, which his sister was always telling him and writing to him about, had gone out of practice lately. But it was just as quiet all around, even though the flat was certainly not empty. What a quiet life the family has been leading, Gregor said to himself. And while he stared rigidly into the darkness in front of him, he felt great pride that he had been able to provide his parents and his sister with such a life in such a fine flat. But what if all this peace, all this comfort, all this contentment were now to come to a horrifying end? So as not to lose himself in such thoughts, Gregor preferred to set himself in motion and crawled up and down the room. Once, during the long evening, one of the side doors was opened a small crack, and once the other, and both were quickly closed again. Someone had felt the need to come in, and then too many misgivings. Gregor now came to a halt immediately by the living room door, determined somehow to bring the hesitating visitor in, or at least to find out who it was. But the door was not opened again, and Gregor waited in vain. Early on, when the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to come in to him. Now that he had opened one door, and the others had evidently been opened during the day, nobody came any more, and the keys were now on the outside. Only late at night was the light in the living room put out, and now it was easy to establish that his parents and his sister had stayed awake all that time, because, as could be heard clearly, all three of them were now going off on tiptoe. So certainly nobody would come in to Gregor again before morning. He had a long time, then, to consider undisturbed how he should order his life now. But the high open room, in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor, frightened him, without his being able to find out why, since it was after all the room he had lived in for 5 years. With a half unconscious turn, and not without a slight shame, he hurried under the couch, where he felt very comfortable at once. Even though his back was pressed a little, and he could no longer raise his head, and where his only regret was that his body was too wide to be got completely under the couch. There he stayed the whole night, which he spent partly in a half-sleep, out of which hunger kept startling him awake, and partly in worries and vague hopes, all of which led to the conclusion that for the time being he must keep quiet, and by patience, and the greatest consideration, must make the unpleasantness bearable for the family, which, in his present condition, he was after all forced to cause them. Early in the morning, while it was still almost night, Gregor had the chance to test the strength of the resolutions he had just made, because his sister, almost fully dressed, opened the door from the hall and looked in eagerly. She did not find him at once, but when she noticed him under the couch, God, he had to be somewhere. He could hardly have flown away. She was so frightened that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again from outside. But, as if she regretted the way she had behaved, she opened the door again at once and came in on tiptoe, as though visiting someone gravely ill, or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward, almost to the edge of the couch, and was watching her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing? And by no means for lack of hunger, and would she bring in some other food that suited him better? If she did not do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to it, although he felt an enormous urge to shoot out from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. But his sister noticed at once, with surprise, the still full bowl, from which only a little milk had spilled around the edge, and she picked it up immediately, not with her bare hands, but with a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious about what she would bring instead, and he thought over all sorts of possibilities. But he could never have guessed what his sister, in her kindness, actually did. To test his taste, she brought him a whole selection, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal, surrounded by congealed white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a cheese which Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a piece of dry bread, a piece of bread and butter, and a piece of bread and butter with salt on it. On top of all this, she set down the bowl that was now probably meant for Gregor, once and for all, into which she had poured water. And out of delicacy, since she knew that Gregor would not eat in front of her, she went away quickly, and even turned the key, just so that Gregor would know he could make himself as comfortable as he liked. Gregor's little legs whirred as he went to eat. His wounds must have healed completely by now. He felt no hindrance any more, and he was astonished at this, and thought how more than a month ago he had cut his finger very slightly with a knife, and how that wound had still hurt him enough the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive now? He thought, and he was already sucking greedily at the cheese, which had drawn him to it at once, and more strongly than any of the other food. One after another, and with his eyes watering with satisfaction, He devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, did not taste good to him. He could not even stand the smell of it, and he actually dragged the things. He wanted to eat a little further away. He had long since finished everything and was lying lazily in the same spot when his sister slowly turned the key as a sign that he should withdraw. That startled him at once, although he was almost dozing, and he hurried back under the couch. But it cost him great self-control to stay under the couch, even for the short time his sister was in the room, because his body had rounded out a little from the ample meal, and he could hardly breathe there, in the narrow space. With small fits of suffocation he watched, his eyes bulging a little, as his unsuspecting sister swept up with a broom not only the leftovers, but also the food Gregor had not even touched, as if that were no longer usable either, and tipped it all hastily into a bucket, which she closed with a wooden lid and carried out. She had hardly turned her back before Gregor pulled himself out from under the couch and stretched and swelled himself up. In this way, Gregor now got his food every day, once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and a second time after the family's midday meal, because then his parents slept for a while as well, and the maid was sent out by his sister on some errand. Certainly, they did not want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps they could not have borne to know more about his eating than by hearsay. Or perhaps his sister wanted to spare them a grief that might after all have been a small one, since in truth they were suffering quite enough already. Gregor could not find out at all what excuses had been used to get the doctor and the locksmith out of the flat again that first morning, because since he was not understood, nobody thought, not even his sister, that he could understand the others. So when his sister was in his room, he had to be content with hearing, now and then, her sighs and her appeals to the saints. Only later, when she had grown a little used to everything, and there could, of course, never be any question of growing completely used to it, Gregor sometimes caught a remark that was meant kindly, or could be taken that way. He enjoyed that today, she would say, when Gregor had cleared away a good deal of the food, while in the opposite case, which gradually came round more and more often, she would say almost sadly, everything has been left standing again. But while Gregor could get no news directly, he overheard a good deal from the neighboring rooms, and wherever he heard voices, he would run at once to the door in question and press his whole body against it. In the early days, especially, there was no conversation that was not somehow about him, even if only in secret. For 2 whole days, there were discussions at every meal about how they should behave now. But between meals they talked about the same subject, because there were always at least 2 members of the family at home, since nobody wanted to stay in the flat alone, and it was out of the question to leave it completely empty. On the very first day, moreover, the maid, and it was not entirely clear what or how much she knew about what had happened, had gone down on her knees and begged his mother to dismiss her at once. Some call me Mother Nature. And when she took her leave a quarter of an hour later, she thanked them in tears for the dismissal, as if for the greatest kindness anyone had ever done her there. Then swore a terrible oath, without being asked, never to give away the slightest thing to anyone. Now, his sister had to do the cooking together with his mother, though this did not cause much trouble, because they ate almost nothing. Again and again Gregor heard one of them urging another to eat in vain, and getting no other answer than, "Thank you, I have had enough," or something of the kind. Perhaps they drank nothing either. Often his sister asked his father whether he would like some beer, and warmly offered to fetch it herself. And when his father was silent, she would say, to remove any hesitation, that she could send the caretaker's wife for it. But then his father would finally say a great no, and no more was said about it. Already in the course of the first day, his father set out the whole financial position and the prospects, both to his mother and to his sister. Now and then he got up from the table and fetched some receipt, or some notebook from the little safe he had saved from the collapse of his business 5 years before. You could hear him unlocking the complicated lock and closing it again, after taking out what he was looking for. These explanations of his father's were, in part, the first cheering thing Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been under the impression that nothing at all was left to his father from that business. At least his father had told him nothing to the contrary. And Gregor, for his part, had not asked him about it. Gregor's only concern at that time had been to do everything he could to make the family forget, as quickly as possible, the business disaster that had brought them all to complete hopelessness. And so he had begun to work then, with a very particular fire, and almost overnight had gone from being a small clerk to a traveling salesman, who of course had quite different opportunities to earn money, and whose successes were turned at once, in the form of commission, into cash that could be laid on the table at home in front of the astonished and delighted family. Those had been fine times, and they had never come again afterwards, at least not with that same glow. Although Gregor later earned so much money that he was able to carry the whole household's expenses, and did carry them. They had simply grown used to it, the family as much as Gregor. They took the money gratefully. He handed it over gladly, but no special warmth came of it any more. Only his sister had stayed close to Gregor, and it was his secret plan to send her next year to the conservatory. Since, unlike Gregor, she loved music very much and played the violin in a way that moved people, regardless of the great cost this would involve, which would be made up some other way. often during Gregor's short stays in town the conservatory was mentioned in his conversations with his sister, but always only as a beautiful dream whose realization was not to be thought of, and his parents did not even like to hear these innocent mentions of it. But Gregor was thinking about it very definitely, and intended to announce it solemnly on Christmas Eve. Such thoughts, completely useless in his present condition, went through his head while he clung upright there against the door and listened. Sometimes, out of general weariness, he could not listen any more, and let his head knock carelessly against the door. But he held it still again at once, because even the small noise he had made had been heard next door, and had silenced everyone. "What is he up to now?" said his father after a while, evidently turned towards the door. And only then was the interrupted conversation gradually taken up again. Gregor now learned in full, because his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because he had not concerned himself with these matters for a long time, and partly because his mother did not understand everything the first time. That, in spite of all the misfortune, a certain small fortune from the old days was still there, which the untouched interest had allowed to grow a little in the meantime. Besides that, the money Gregor had brought home every month, and he had kept only a few gulden for himself, had not been used up completely, and had accumulated into a small capital. Behind his door Gregor nodded eagerly, delighted at this unexpected foresight and thrift. In fact, he could have used this surplus money to pay off more of his father's debt to the chief, and the day when he could have got rid of that post would have been far nearer. But as things stood, it was undoubtedly better, the way his father had arranged it. Now, this money was not nearly enough for the family to live on the interest. It might have been enough to keep the family for 1 year, at most 2, no more. So it was only a sum that really should not be touched, and had to be put aside for an emergency. The money to live on had to be earned. Now his father was healthy, but he was an old man who had not worked for 5 years and could not be expected to take much on. In those 5 years, which were the first holiday of his laborious and yet unsuccessful life, he had put on a good deal of fat and had become quite slow. And was his old mother now to earn money, when she suffered from asthma, when walking through the flat was already an effort for her, and when every second day she spent struggling for breath on the sofa by the open window? And was his sister to earn money, a child of 17, who deserved so completely the life she had led so far, which had consisted of dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping in the house, taking part in a few modest amusements, and above all playing the violin? Whenever the talk came round to this need to earn money, Gregor always let go of the door first and threw himself onto the cool leather sofa beside it, because he was hot all over with shame and grief. Often, He lay there through the whole long night, not sleeping for a moment, only scratching at the leather for hours. Or he would not shrink from the great effort of pushing a chair to the window, then crawling up the window ledge, and, braced against the chair, leaning against the glass, evidently in some memory of the sense of freedom that looking out of the window had once given him. For, in fact, he saw the things even a little way off less, and less clearly from day to day. The hospital opposite, the all too frequent sight of which he had once cursed, he could no longer see at all. And if he had not known perfectly well that he lived in the quiet but thoroughly urban Charlottenstrasse, he might have believed he was looking out of his window into a wasteland in which the gray sky and the gray earth joined indistinguishably. Only twice did his attentive sister have to see that the chair was standing by the window before she began, every time she had tidied the room, to push the chair back exactly to the window, and even, from then on, to leave the inner casement open. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him, he would have borne her services more easily. As it was, he suffered under them. His sister certainly tried to smooth over the awkwardness of the whole thing, as far as she could, and the more time passed the better. She naturally managed it. But with time Gregor also saw through it all much more clearly. Her very entrance was terrible for him. Hardly had she come in when, without taking the time to close the door, careful as she otherwise was to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, she ran straight to the window and tore it open with hasty hands, as though she were suffocating, and stayed by the window a little while breathing deeply, even when it was very cold. With this running and noise, she frightened Gregor twice a day. He trembled under the couch the whole time, knowing perfectly well that she would gladly have spared him it, if only it had been possible for her to stay in a room where Gregor was with the window shut. Once, when about a month had passed since Gregor's transformation, and there was no longer any particular reason for his sister to be astonished at his appearance, she came a little earlier than usual and found Gregor, still looking out of the window, motionless and positioned in a way that was genuinely frightening. It would not have surprised Gregor if she had not come in, since his position prevented her from opening the window at once. But she not only did not come in, she started back and shut the door. A stranger might well have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her and meant to bite her. Gregor, of course, hid himself under the couch at once. But he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. From that, he understood that the sight of him was still unbearable to her, and would have to remain unbearable, and that she must be making a great effort not to run from the sight of even the small part of his body that stuck out from under the couch. to spare her even that sight. One day he carried the sheet on his back to the couch. It took him 4 hours of work, and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely hidden, and that his sister could not see him, even if she bent down. If she had thought this sheet unnecessary, she could have removed it, since it was clear enough that it could be no pleasure for Gregor to shut himself off so completely. But she left the sheet as it was, and Gregor even believed he had caught a grateful look when he once lifted the sheet a little with his head, carefully, to see how his sister was taking the new arrangement. For the first fortnight his parents could not bring themselves to come in to him, and he often heard them, fully acknowledging the work his sister was doing now, whereas until then they had frequently been annoyed with her, because she had struck them as a somewhat useless girl. Now, though, both of them, his father and his mother, would often wait outside Gregor's room while his sister tidied up in there. And hardly had she come out when she had to tell them exactly how the room looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether some small improvement might be noticed. His mother, by the way, wanted to visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and his sister held her back at first with sensible arguments, which Gregor listened to very attentively and entirely approved of. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, and when she then cried, "Let me go to Gregor, he is my unhappy son. Don't you understand that I have to go to him?" Then Gregor thought that it might perhaps be good after all if his mother came in. Not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood everything much better than his sister, who for all her courage was still only a child, and who at bottom had perhaps taken on such a hard task out of nothing more than childish thoughtlessness. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day Gregor did not want to show himself at the window, out of consideration for his parents. But he could not crawl about much on the few square meters of floor either. He found it hard to lie still even at night. Eating soon gave him no pleasure at all. And so, for distraction, he took up the habit of crawling back and forth, across the walls and the ceiling. He especially liked hanging up on the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the floor. You breathed more freely. A light swinging went through the body, and in the almost happy absent-mindedness that came over Gregor up there, it could happen that, to his own surprise, he let go and slapped down onto the floor. But now, of course, he had his body under quite different control than before, and he did not injure himself, even in such a great fall. His sister noticed at once the new entertainment Gregor had found for himself, since he left traces of his sticky substance here and there as he crawled. And she took it into her head to make it possible for Gregor to crawl on the largest possible scale and to remove the furniture that got in the way. Above all, the chest of drawers and the writing desk. But she was not able to do this alone. She did not dare ask her father for help. The maid would certainly not have helped her, because this girl of about 16 was holding out bravely, since the former cook had left, but had asked for the concession of being allowed to keep the kitchen locked at all times, and to open it only when specially called. So there was nothing left for his sister but to fetch her mother one day when their father was out. His mother came along with cries of excited joy, but fell silent at the door of Gregor's room. First, his sister, of course, looked to see whether everything in the room was in order, and only then let her mother come in. In the greatest haste, Gregor had pulled the sheet down further and into more folds. The whole thing really did look like a sheet thrown over the couch by chance. This time, too, Gregor refrained from spying out from under the sheet. He gave up seeing his mother on this occasion and was simply glad that she had come after all. "Come on, you cannot see him," said his sister. And evidently she was leading her mother by the hand. Gregor now heard the two weak women shifting the old chest of drawers, heavy as it was, from its place, and heard his sister constantly claiming the greater part of the work for herself, without listening to her mother's warnings that she would strain herself. It took a very long time. After a good quarter of an hour of work, his mother said that it would be better to leave the chest where it was, because in the first place it was too heavy. They would not be finished before their father arrived, and with the chest in the middle of the room, it would block Gregor's way everywhere. And in the second place, it was not at all certain that they were doing Gregor a favor by taking the furniture away. To her it seemed the opposite. The sight of the bare wall positively oppressed her heart, and why should Gregor not feel the same? Since he had long been used to the furniture in the room, and would therefore feel abandoned in an empty one. And is it not? His mother concluded very quietly, and indeed she was almost whispering the whole time, as if she wanted to avoid Gregor, whose exact position she did not know, hearing even the sound of her voice, since she was convinced he did not understand the words. And is it not as though, by taking the furniture away, we were showing that we are giving up all hope of improvement and leaving him to himself without any consideration? I think it would be best if we tried to keep the room exactly in the state it was in before, so that when Gregor comes back to us, he will find everything unchanged and can forget the time in between all the more easily. Hearing these words from his mother, Gregor realized that the lack of any direct human conversation, together with the monotonous life in the middle of the family, must have confused his mind over these 2 months, because he could not otherwise explain to himself how he could seriously have wanted his room emptied out. Did he really want the warm room, comfortably fitted with furniture he had inherited, to be turned into a cave, in which he would admittedly be able to crawl undisturbed in every direction, but at the price of a quick and complete forgetting of his human past. He was already close to forgetting now, and only his mother's voice, which he had not heard for so long, had shaken him awake. Nothing should be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not do without the good effect of the furniture on his condition. And if the furniture prevented him from carrying on his senseless, crawling about, then that was no loss, but a great advantage. But his sister unfortunately took a different view. She had got into the habit, not entirely without justification, of presenting herself to her parents as a particular expert whenever Gregor's affairs were discussed. And so now, to her mother's advice was reason enough for his sister to insist on removing not only the chest of drawers and the writing desk, which was all she had thought of at first, but all the furniture, with the exception of the indispensable couch. It was not only childish defiance and the self-confidence she had gained so unexpectedly and with such difficulty in recent times that made her demand this. She had, in fact, observed that Gregor needed a lot of room to crawl in, while as far as anyone could see, he made no use of the furniture at all. But perhaps the enthusiastic temperament of girls of her age also played a part, which looks for its satisfaction at every opportunity, and by which Greta was now tempted into wanting to make Gregor's situation still more frightening, so that she could then do even more for him than before. For into a room where Gregor ruled the bare walls all alone, no human being except Greta would ever dare to set foot. And so, she would not be talked out of her decision by her mother, who in that room seemed uncertain from sheer uneasiness. Soon fell silent and helped her daughter as best she could to get the chest of drawers out. Well, Gregor could do without the chest of drawers at a pinch, but the writing desk had to stay. And hardly had the women left the room with the chest, groaning as they pushed at it, when Gregor stuck his head out from under the couch to see how he might intervene carefully and as considerately as possible. But unfortunately, it was his mother who came back first, while Greta in the next room had her arms around the chest and was rocking it back and forth on her own, without of course moving it from the spot. His mother, though, was not used to the sight of Gregor. It might have made her ill, and so Gregor hurried backwards, in fright to the other end of the couch, but could no longer prevent the sheet at the front from moving a little. That was enough to catch his mother's attention. She faltered, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greta. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing extraordinary was happening, that only a few pieces of furniture were being moved. He soon had to admit that this going back and forth of the women, their small calls to each other, the scraping of the furniture on the floor, affected him like a great commotion fed from every side, and however tightly he pulled in his head and legs, and pressed his body to the floor. He had to tell himself that he would not be able to stand the whole thing for long. They were clearing out his room, taking away everything he loved. They had already carried out the chest of drawers with his fret saw and his other tools in it. Now, they were working loose the writing desk that had bedded itself into the floor, the desk at which he had written his exercises as a student at the commercial academy, as a schoolboy, even as a small boy at primary school. At that point, he really had no more time to consider the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had almost forgotten anyway, because they were working in silence now from exhaustion, and all that could be heard was the heavy tramping of their feet. And so he broke out. The women were just leaning against the writing desk in the next room to get their breath back, changed the direction of his run 4 times. He really did not know what to save first, and then he saw, hanging conspicuously on the otherwise already bare wall, the picture of the lady dressed all in furs. He crawled up to it quickly and pressed himself against the glass, which held him fast and felt good against his hot belly. This picture at least, which Gregor was now covering completely, was certainly not going to be taken away by anyone. He twisted his head towards the living room door to watch the women when they came back. They had not allowed themselves much rest and were already returning. Greta had her arm around her mother and was almost carrying her. "So what shall we take now?" said Greta, and looked around. Then her eyes met Gregor's on the wall. No doubt only because of her mother's presence, she kept her composure, bent her face towards her mother, to keep her from looking round, and said, trembling and without thinking, "Come, wouldn't we rather go back into the living room for a moment?" Greta's intention was clear to Gregor. She wanted to get her mother to safety and then chase him down off the wall. Well, let her try. He was sitting on his picture, and he would not give it up. He would sooner spring into Greta's face. But Greta's words had made her mother uneasy after all. She stepped aside, caught sight of the huge brown patch on the flowered wallpaper, and before it really reached her consciousness that what she was seeing was Gregor, cried out in a screaming, hoarse voice, "Oh God, oh God," and fell across the couch with her arms spread wide, as if giving everything up, and did not move. "You, Gregor," cried his sister with a raised fist and a hard look. They were the first words she had addressed directly to him since the transformation. She ran into the next room to fetch some essence, with which she could wake her mother from her faint. Gregor wanted to help too. There was still time to save the picture. But he was stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself loose by force. Then he ran into the next room as well, as if he could give his sister some advice as in earlier days. But he had to stand behind her doing nothing. While she rummaged among various little bottles, she gave herself another fright when she turned round. A bottle fell to the floor and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face, and some corrosive medicine flowed around him. Greta now took as many little bottles as she could hold, without delaying any longer, and ran with them in to her mother, slamming the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now shut off from his mother, who was perhaps close to death through his fault. He could not open the door without driving away his sister, who had to stay with her mother. There was nothing for him to do now but wait, and pressed by self-reproach and worry, he began to crawl. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, and finally, in his despair, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the big table. A little while passed. Gregor lay there exhausted. Everything was quiet around him. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The maid was, of course, shut up in her kitchen, so Greta had to go and open the door. His father had come home. "What has happened?" were his first words. Greta's appearance must have told him everything. Greta answered in a muffled voice, evidently pressing her face against her father's chest. "Mother fainted, but she is better now. Gregor has broken out." "I expected it," said his father. "I always told you so, but you women will not listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had put the worst interpretation on Greta's far too brief report, and assumed that Gregor had been guilty of some act of violence. So Gregor had to try to calm his father down now, because he had neither the time nor the means to explain. And so he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that his father, coming in from the hall, could see at once that Gregor had every intention of returning to his room immediately, and that there was no need to drive him back, that they only had to open the door, and he would disappear at once. But his father was in no mood to notice such subtleties. "Ah!" he cried as soon as he came in a tone that sounded furious and delighted at once. Gregor drew his head back from the door and raised it towards his father. He had really not imagined his father as he stood there now, admittedly. In recent times, he had been so taken up with his new way of crawling about that he had neglected to concern himself with what was going on in the rest of the flat, as he used to, and he ought to have been prepared to find things changed. And yet, was that still his father? The same man who used to lie buried and weary in bed when Gregor set out on a business trip, who received him on the evenings of his return in his dressing gown in the armchair, who was not really able to get up, but only raised his arms as a sign of joy, and who on the rare walks they took together on a few Sundays in the year, and on the great holidays, wrapped in his old coat, working his way forward between Gregor and his mother, who already walked slowly, always a little more slowly still, setting his walking stick down carefully, and who almost always stopped when he wanted to say something and gathered his companions around him. But now he was standing quite upright, dressed in a tight blue uniform with gold buttons, of the kind worn by porters at banking houses. Above the high stiff collar of the coat, his heavy double chin spread out. From under his bushy eyebrows, the look of his black eyes came out fresh and alert. His white hair, usually untidy, was combed down into a painfully exact and gleaming parting. He threw his cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably that of a bank, in an arc across the whole room onto the couch, and moved towards Gregor, with the ends of his long uniform coat thrown back, his hands in his trouser pockets, and a grim look on his face. He probably did not know himself what he intended. Even so, he lifted his feet unusually high, and Gregor was astonished at the enormous size of the soles of his boots. But he did not dwell on that. He had known, since the first day of his new life, that his father considered only the greatest severity appropriate towards him. And so he ran ahead of his father, stopping when his father stood still and hurrying forward again, as soon as his father so much as stirred. In this way they went round the room several times, without anything decisive happening. Indeed, without the whole thing even looking like a chase, because of its slow pace. So, Gregor stayed on the floor for the time being, especially since he feared his father might take an escape onto the walls or the ceiling as particular wickedness. Even so, Gregor had to admit to himself that he could not keep up even this running for long, because while his father took one step, he had to carry out an untold number of movements. Shortness of breath was already making itself felt, and in his earlier life his lungs had not been entirely reliable either. As he now staggered along, gathering all his strength for the run, hardly keeping his eyes open, in his dullness, not thinking of any escape, but running, and having almost forgotten that the walls were open to him, though here they were blocked with carefully carved furniture, full of points and spikes. Something flew down close beside him, lightly thrown, and rolled along in front of him. It was an apple. A second one flew after it at once. Gregor stopped in terror. Running further was useless, because his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and was now throwing apple after apple, without taking careful aim for the moment. These small red apples rolled about the floor, as if electrified, and knocked into one another. One weakly thrown apple grazed Gregor's back, but slid off harmlessly. Another, flying after it at once, drove right into Gregor's back. Gregor wanted to drag himself further, as if the surprising and unbelievable pain might pass with a change of place. But he felt as though nailed down and stretched himself out in complete confusion of all his senses. With his last look, he still saw the door of his room being torn open and his mother rushing out ahead of his screaming sister in her chemise, because his sister had undressed her to give her air, while she was unconscious, and then his mother running towards his father. her loosened skirts sliding to the floor one after another on the way, and stumbling over them as she pressed towards his father and embraced him, in complete union with him. But Gregor's sight was already failing now, and with her hands at the back of his father's head, she begged him to spare Gregor's life. Part 3. Gregor's serious wound, from which he suffered for more than a month, since nobody dared remove the apple. It stayed lodged in his flesh as a visible reminder. Seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregor, in spite of his present sad and disgusting shape, was a member of the family who must not be treated as an enemy, and that family duty demanded, instead, that they swallow their disgust and endure him, and nothing more. And although Gregor had probably lost his mobility for good because of his wound, and for the time being needed long minutes to cross his room like an old invalid, crawling up high was not to be thought of. He received compensation for this worsening of his condition, which he considered entirely sufficient. Every evening the living room door, which he was in the habit of watching closely for an hour or two beforehand, was opened, so that lying in the dark of his room, invisible from the living room, he was allowed to see the whole family at the lighted table, and to listen to their talk with general permission, as it were, and so quite differently from before. Of course, these were no longer the lively conversations of earlier times, which Gregor had always thought of with a certain longing in his small hotel rooms, when he had to throw himself warily into the damp bedding. It was mostly very quiet now. His father fell asleep in his armchair soon after supper. His mother and sister urged each other to be quiet. His mother, bent far forward under the light, sewed fine underwear for a fashion shop. His sister, who had taken a job as a shop assistant, was learning shorthand and French in the evening, so that she might perhaps get a better position later on. Sometimes his father woke up, and as if he had no idea that he had been asleep, said to his mother, "How long you have been sewing again today," and fell asleep again at once, while mother and sister smiled warily at each other. With a kind of stubbornness, his father refused to take off his uniform, even at home, and while his dressing gown hung uselessly on its hook, his father dozed in his place fully dressed, as though he were always ready for duty, and were waiting for his superior's voice, even here. As a result, the uniform, which had not been new to begin with, lost its cleanliness in spite of all the care his mother and sister took. And Gregor often spent whole evenings looking at this garment, stained all over and gleaming with its constantly polished gold buttons, in which the old man slept most uncomfortably and yet peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, his mother would try to wake his father with quiet words, and then persuade him to go to bed, because this was no proper sleep, and his father, who had to start work at 6, needed proper sleep badly. but in the stubbornness that had taken hold of him since he became a porter. He always insisted on staying longer at the table, although he regularly fell asleep. And then he could only be moved to exchange the armchair for his bed with the greatest difficulty. However much his mother and sister pressed him with small urgings, he would shake his head slowly for a quarter of an hour at a time, keep his eyes closed, and not get up. His mother tugged at his sleeve and said flattering words into his ear. His sister left her work to help her mother, but none of it worked on his father. He only sank deeper into his chair. Only when the women took him under the arms did he open his eyes, look from his mother to his sister and back, and say, "What a life! This is the peace of my old age." And leaning on the two women, he would rise, laboriously, as if he were the greatest burden to himself, let himself be led to the door by them, wave them away there, and go on by himself, while his mother threw down her sewing and his sister her pen to run after him and help him further. Who in this overworked and exhausted family had time to concern themselves with Gregor more than was absolutely necessary? The household was cut back more and more. The maid was let go after all. A gigantic, bony charwoman, with white hair flying about her head, came in the morning and the evening to do the heaviest work. Everything else his mother saw to, on top of all her sewing. It even happened that various pieces of family jewelry, which his mother and sister had once worn with such delight at parties and celebrations, were sold. As Gregor learned in the evening from the general discussion of the prices they had fetched. But the greatest complaint was always that they could not leave this flat, far too large for their present circumstances, since there was no imagining how Gregor could be moved. But Gregor understood well enough that it was not only consideration for him that prevented a move, since he could easily have been transported in a suitable crate with a few air holes. What mainly held the family back from changing flats was rather their complete hopelessness, and the thought that they had been struck by a misfortune such as nobody else in their whole circle of relatives and acquaintances had suffered. What the world demands of poor people, they fulfilled to the utmost. His father fetched breakfast for the junior bank clerks. His mother wore herself out over strangers' linen. His sister ran back and forth behind the counter at the customer's command. But the family's strength went no further than that. And the wound in Gregor's back began to hurt him as if it were new whenever his mother and sister, having got his father to bed, came back, left their work lying, moved close together, and sat cheek to cheek, and when his mother, pointing to Gregor's room, said, "Shut that door, Greta," and when Gregor was in the dark again, while next door the women mingled their tears, or stared at the table without any tears at all. Gregor spent the nights and days almost entirely without sleep. Sometimes he thought that the next time the door opened, he would take the family's affairs in hand again, exactly as before. In his thoughts, after a long time, there appeared again the chief and the chief clerk, the salesman and the apprentices, the slow-witted porter. 2 or 3 friends from other firms, a chambermaid from a hotel in the provinces, a dear and fleeting memory of a cashier from a hat shop whom he had courted seriously but too slowly. They all appeared, mixed in with strangers or people he had already forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable. And he was glad when they disappeared. Then again, he was in no mood at all to worry about his family, and was filled only with rage at how badly he was being looked after. And although he could not imagine anything he might have an appetite for, he still made plans for how he might get into the pantry to take what was, after all, his due, even if he was not hungry. Without thinking any more about what might give Gregor particular pleasure, his sister now hurriedly shoved any food at all into Gregor's room with her foot before she ran off to the shop in the morning and at midday. Then swept it out again in the evening with a swing of the broom, indifferent to whether the food had merely been tasted or, as was most often the case, left completely untouched. The tidying of the room, which she now always did in the evening, could not have been done more quickly. Streaks of dirt ran along the walls. Here and there lay balls of dust and filth. At first Gregor would station himself in some particularly telling corner when his sister arrived, so as to reproach her, as it were, by taking up that position. But he could have stayed there for weeks without his sister improving. She saw the dirt exactly as well as he did, but she had simply decided to leave it. At the same time she watched, with a sensitivity quite new in her, which had in fact taken hold of the whole family, to make sure that the tidying of Gregor's room remained her business alone. Once his mother had given Gregor's room a great cleaning, which she had only managed after using several buckets of water, and all that damp did indeed upset Gregor too, and he lay flat, embittered and motionless on the couch. But his mother's punishment was not long in coming, for hardly had his sister noticed the change in Gregor's room that evening when she ran, deeply offended, into the living room and, despite her mother's imploringly raised hands, broke into a fit of weeping, which her parents and his father had, of course, been startled out of his chair, watched at first with astonishment and helplessness, until they too began to stir. His father, on the right, reproached his mother for not leaving the cleaning of Gregor's room to his sister, while on the left he shouted at his sister that she would never again be allowed to clean Gregor's room. Meanwhile his mother tried to drag his father, who was beside himself with agitation, into the bedroom, his sister, shaken with sobs, hammered at the table with her small fists, and Gregor hissed loudly, with rage that nobody thought to shut the door and spare him this sight and this noise. But even if his sister, exhausted by her work, had grown tired of caring for Gregor, as she once had, his mother would by no means have had to step in for her. And Gregor need not have been neglected, because now there was the charwoman. This old widow, who in her long life had probably survived the worst with the help of her strong bones, felt no real disgust at Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once happened to open the door of Gregor's room, and at the sight of Gregor, who was completely taken by surprise and began to run back and forth, although nobody was chasing him, she had stood still in astonishment with her hands folded in her lap. Since then she never failed to open the door a little, briefly, morning and evening, and look in at Gregor. At first she also called him over to her with words she probably thought friendly, like, "Come over here, you old dung beetle," or "Orzie, look at the old dung beetle." To such addresses Gregor made no answer, but stayed motionless where he was, as if the door had not been opened at all. If only they had given this charwoman orders to clean his room every day, instead of letting her disturb him, uselessly, whenever the mood took her. Once, early in the morning, heavy rain was beating on the panes, perhaps already a sign of the coming spring. Gregor was so embittered when the charwoman started up with her phrases again that he turned towards her as if to attack, though slowly and feebly. But the charwoman, instead of being frightened, merely lifted high a chair that stood near the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, her intention was clear. She would close her mouth only when the chair in her hand had come down on Gregor's back. "So that is as far as you go, is it?" she asked as Gregor turned away again, and she put the chair quietly back in the corner. Gregor now ate almost nothing at all. Only when he happened to pass the food that had been put out did he take a bite into his mouth for the sake of it, hold it there for hours, and then usually spit it out again. At first he thought it was grief over the state of his room that kept him from eating, but he very soon made his peace with the changes in the room. People had got into the habit of putting into this room anything they could not find a place for elsewhere, and there were many such things now, since one room of the flat had been let to 3 lodgers. These serious gentlemen, all 3 of them had full beards, as Gregor once established through a crack in the door, were painfully concerned with order. Not only in their own room, but, since they had taken lodgings here, in the whole household, and particularly in the kitchen. They could not bear useless or dirty clutter. Besides, they had brought most of their own furnishings with them. For this reason many things had become superfluous, which could not be sold, but which nobody wanted to throw away either. All of these ended up in Gregor's room. So did the ash bin and the rubbish bin from the kitchen. Anything that was of no immediate use the charwoman, who was always in a great hurry, simply hurled into Gregor's room. Fortunately, Gregor usually saw only the object in question and the hand that held it. The charwoman perhaps intended to fetch the things back when there was time and opportunity, or to throw them all out at once. But in fact, they stayed lying where they had landed with the first throw, unless Gregor wound his way through the junk and set it moving. At first because he was forced to, since there was no other free space to crawl in, but later with growing pleasure. Although after such wanderings, he would lie without stirring for hours, tired to death and full of sorrow. Since the lodgers sometimes took their supper at home in the shared living room, the living room door stayed shut on some evenings. But Gregor gave up the open door quite easily, since there had already been evenings when it was open, and he had not made use of it, but had lain in the darkest corner of his room, without the family noticing. Once, though, the charwoman had left the door to the living room slightly open, and it stayed open even when the lodgers came in that evening, and the light was turned on. They sat down at the head of the table, where in earlier times his father, his mother, and Gregor had sat, unfolded their napkins, and took up knife and fork. At once his mother appeared in the doorway with a dish of meat, and just behind her his sister with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food steamed thickly. The lodgers bent over the dishes set in front of them, as if to examine them before eating, and in fact the one who sat in the middle, and who seemed to count as an authority with the other two, cut a piece of meat while it was still on the dish, evidently to establish whether it was tender enough and whether it might have to be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and his mother and sister, who had been watching anxiously, began to smile with relief. The family itself ate in the kitchen. Even so, before he went to the kitchen, his father came into this room and made one single bow, cap in hand, as he walked around the table. All the lodgers rose and murmured something into their beards. When they were alone again, they ate in almost complete silence. It seemed strange to Gregor that out of all the various noises of eating, he kept hearing their chewing teeth, as if to show Gregor that you need teeth to eat, and that with the finest toothless jaws you can do nothing at all. I do have an appetite, Gregor said to himself, full of worry, but not for these things. How these lodgers feed themselves, and I am dying of it. That very evening, and Gregor could not remember, having heard the violin in all that time, it sounded from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their supper. The one in the middle had taken out a newspaper and given a sheet each to the other two, and now they leaned back reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they became attentive, got up, and went on tiptoe to the hall door, where they stood pressed together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, because his father called, "Does the playing perhaps disturb the gentleman?" It can be stopped at once. On the contrary, said the gentleman in the middle, "would the young lady not like to come in to us and play here in this room, where it is far more comfortable and pleasant?" "Oh, by all means," called his father, as if he were the violinist himself. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon his father came with the music stand, his mother with the music, and his sister with the violin. His sister quietly prepared everything for playing. His parents, who had never let rooms before, and therefore overdid their politeness to the lodgers, did not dare sit down in their own chairs. His father leaned against the door, with his right hand pushed between two buttons of his closed livery coat. But his mother was offered a chair by one of the gentlemen, and since she left the chair where he happened to have put it, she sat off to one side in a corner. His sister began to play. His father and mother, each from their own side, followed the movements of her hands attentively, drawn by the playing. Gregor had ventured a little further forward and already had his head in the living room. He was hardly surprised at himself for showing so little consideration for the others lately. Once that consideration had been his pride. And yet, just now he would have had more reason to hide, because of the dust that lay everywhere in his room, and flew up at the slightest movement, so that he too was covered in dust. He dragged threads, hairs and scraps of food about with him on his back and along his sides. His indifference to everything was far too great for him to lie on his back and scrub himself on the carpet, as he had done several times a day before. And in spite of this state, he had no shame about pushing forward a little onto the spotless floor of the living room. Admittedly, nobody paid any attention to him. The family was completely taken up with the violin playing. The lodgers, on the other hand, who had at first stationed themselves with their hands in their trouser pockets, far too close behind his sister's music stand, so that they could all see the score, which must certainly have disturbed her, soon withdrew to the window with lowered heads, talking in undertones, and stayed there while his father watched them anxiously. It now really did look all too clearly, as if they had been disappointed in their assumption that they would hear beautiful or entertaining violin playing, had had enough of the whole performance, and were only letting their peace be disturbed out of politeness. In particular, the way they all blew their cigar smoke upwards out of nose and mouth suggested great impatience. And yet his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was tilted to one side, her eyes following the lines of the score, searchingly and sadly. Gregor crawled forward a little more and held his head close to the floor, so that he might possibly meet her eyes. Others, he an animal. That music moved him so. He felt as though the way were opening to the unknown nourishment he longed for. He was determined to push forward all the way to his sister, to tug at her skirt and let her know that she should come into his room with her violin. because nobody here rewarded her playing as he wanted to reward it. He would never let her out of his room again, at least not as long as he lived. His frightful shape would be of use to him for the first time. He would be at all the doors of his room at once and hiss at the attackers. But his sister should not be forced to stay with him. She should stay of her own free will. She should sit beside him on the couch and bend her ear down to him. And then he would confide to her that he had firmly intended to send her to the conservatory, and that if the misfortune had not come in between, he would have told everyone last Christmas. Christmas surely was over by now, without caring about any objections. After this declaration, his sister would burst into tears of emotion, and Gregor would raise himself up to her shoulder and kiss her on the neck, which she had left bare, without ribbon or collar, since she started going out to work. Mr. Samsa called the gentleman in the middle to his father, and without wasting another word, he pointed his forefinger at Gregor as he slowly moved forward. The violin fell silent. The lodger in the middle first smiled at his friends with a shake of the head, and then looked at Gregor again. His father seemed to think it more urgent to calm the lodgers than to drive Gregor away. Although they were not at all agitated, and seemed to find Gregor more entertaining than the violin playing. He hurried over to them and tried with outspread arms to push them into their room, and at the same time to block their view of Gregor with his body. Now they really did become a little angry, though it was no longer clear whether at his father's behavior or at the realization dawning on them now that they had been living next door to a creature like Gregor without knowing it. They demanded explanations from his father, raised their own arms, tugged uneasily at their beards, and retreated only slowly towards their room. Meanwhile, his sister had overcome the lost feeling that had come over her after the playing broke off so suddenly. After holding the violin and bow for a while in her limply hanging hands and going on looking at the score, as if she were still playing, she had pulled herself together all at once, laid the instrument in the lap of her mother, who was still sitting in her chair, struggling for breath with her lungs, working violently, and had run into the next room, which the lodgers were already approaching more quickly under his father's pressure. You could see the blankets and pillows in the beds flying up and arranging themselves under his sister's practiced hands. Before the gentleman had even reached the room, she had finished making the beds and slipped out. His father seemed once again so gripped by his stubbornness that he forgot all the respect he still owed his tenants. He only pressed and pressed until in the doorway of the room the gentleman in the middle stamped his foot thunderously and brought his father to a halt. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and looking for his mother and sister with his eyes as well, "that in view of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this flat and this family, and here he spat briefly and decisively on the floor. I give notice on my room with immediate effect. I shall naturally pay nothing whatever for the days I have lived here. On the contrary, I shall consider whether to bring some claim against you, and believe me, one very easily justified. He fell silent and looked straight ahead, as if waiting for something. And indeed his two friends chimed in at once with the words, "We give notice with immediate effect as well." At that he seized the door handle and shut the door with a crash. His father staggered to his chair with groping hands and let himself fall into it. It looked as though he were stretching out for his usual evening nap. But the heavy nodding of his head, as if it had no support, showed that he was not asleep at all. Gregor had lain still the whole time in the place where the lodgers had caught him. His disappointment at the failure of his plan, and perhaps also the weakness caused by so much hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He was afraid, with a certain definiteness, that the next moment would bring a general collapse down on top of him, and he waited. He was not even startled by the violin, which fell from his mother's lap out of her trembling fingers and gave off a ringing note. "Dear parents," said his sister, striking the table with her hand by way of introduction, "this cannot go on. If you cannot see it, I can. I will not speak my brother's name in front of this monster, and so I say only this: we have to try to get rid of it. We have tried everything humanly possible to care for it and to put up with it. I do not think anyone can reproach us in the slightest. She is right 1,000 times over," said his father to himself. His mother, who still could not get enough breath, began to cough dully into the hand she held in front of her, with a wild look in her eyes. His sister hurried to her mother and held her forehead. His father seemed to have been brought to more definite thoughts by his sister's words. He had sat up straight, was playing with his porter's cap, among the plates that still stood on the table from the lodger's supper, and looked now and then at the motionless Gregor. "We have to try to get rid of it. His sister now," said to her father alone, because her mother heard nothing through her coughing. "It will be the death of you both. I can see it coming. When people have to work as hard as we all do, they cannot bear this endless torment at home as well. I cannot bear it any more either." And she broke into such violent weeping that her tears ran down onto her mother's face, from which she wiped them with mechanical movements of her hand. "Child," said his father with sympathy and remarkable understanding, "but what are we to do?" His sister only shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness that had come over her while she wept, in contrast to her earlier certainty. "If he understood us," said his father, half as a question. His sister, in the middle of her weeping, shook her hand violently as a sign that this was not to be thought of. "If he understood us," his father repeated, and by closing his eyes he took in his sister's conviction that it was impossible. Then perhaps some agreement with him would be possible. But as it is, "It has to go," cried his sister. "That is the only way, father. You just have to try to get rid of the idea that it is Gregor. That we believed it for so long is our real misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that human beings cannot live together with an animal like that, and he would have gone away of his own accord. Then we would have no brother, but we could go on living and honor his memory. As it is, this animal persecutes us, drives away the lodgers, obviously wants to take over the whole flat, and leave us to sleep in the street. Look, father!" She suddenly screamed, "He is starting again." And, in a fright that Gregor found completely incomprehensible, his sister even abandoned her mother, positively pushed herself away from her chair, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than stay near Gregor, and hurried behind her father, who, agitated purely by her behavior, also stood up and half raised his arms in front of her, as if to protect her. But it had not even occurred to Gregor to want to frighten anyone, least of all his sister. He had only begun to turn round in order to make his way back to his room, and that did admittedly look strange, since in his suffering state he had to help himself through the difficult turns with his head, which he raised and struck against the floor, many times in the process. He stopped and looked around. His good intention seemed to have been recognized. It had only been a momentary fright. Now they all looked at him in silence and sorrow. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed together, her eyes almost closing from exhaustion. His father and sister sat side by side, and his sister had put her hand around her father's neck. "Perhaps I may turn round now," thought Gregor, and began his work again. He could not hold back the snorting of the effort, and had to rest now, and then as well. Otherwise nobody was pressing him. It was all left to him. When he had completed the turn, he began at once to make his way straight back. He was astonished at the great distance that separated him from his room, and could not understand at all how, weak as he was, he had covered the same distance a short while ago almost without noticing it. Thinking constantly of nothing, but crawling fast, he hardly noticed that not a word, not a cry from his family disturbed him. Only when he was already in the doorway did he turn his head, not completely, because he felt his neck growing stiff, but he still saw that nothing behind him had changed. Only his sister had stood up. His last look brushed his mother, who was now fast asleep. He was hardly inside his room when the door was hurriedly pushed shut, bolted, and locked. Gregor was so startled by the sudden noise behind him that his little legs gave way. It was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She had already been standing there upright, waiting, and had sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all. and she cried at last to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. And now, Gregor asked himself, and looked around in the dark. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at this. Rather, it seemed to him unnatural that he had actually been able to move about until now on these thin little legs. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. He had pains in his whole body, but it seemed to him that they were growing weaker and weaker, and would finally disappear altogether. He could hardly feel the rotting apple in his back and the inflamed area around it, which was covered all over with soft dust. He thought back on his family with tenderness and love. His conviction that he had to disappear was, if anything, even firmer than his sister's. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. He lived to see the beginning of the general lightning outside the window. Then his head sank down of its own accord, and from his nostrils his last breath flowed weakly out. When the charwoman came early in the morning, out of sheer strength and haste, she slammed every door so hard, however often she had been asked not to, that from the moment she arrived no quiet sleep was possible anywhere in the flat. She at first noticed nothing unusual on her customary short visit to Gregor. She thought he was lying there, motionless on purpose, and playing the injured party. She credited him with every possible kind of understanding. Because she happened to be holding the long broom, she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When that produced no result either, she became annoyed and jabbed a little at Gregor. And only when she had pushed him from his place, without any resistance, did she pay attention. When she soon grasped the true state of affairs, her eyes went wide, and she whistled to herself, but she did not stay long. She tore open the bedroom door and called loudly into the darkness, "Come and look at this. It has croaked. There it lies, dead as anything." Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat up in their marriage bed and had to get over the fright the charwoman had given them before they took in what she was reporting. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa climbed hurriedly out of bed, each on their own side. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa came out in nothing but her nightdress, and like that they went into Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room had opened too, where Greta had been sleeping since the lodgers moved in. She was fully dressed, as if she had not slept at all, and her pale face seemed to prove it. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, and looked up questioningly at the charwoman, although she could examine everything herself, and could see it even without examining. "I should say so," said the charwoman, and to prove it she pushed Gregor's body a good way sideways with the broom. Mrs. Samsa made a movement, as if to hold the broom back, but did not do it. "Well," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can thank God." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. Greta, who did not take her eyes off the body, said, "Look, how thin he was. He had not eaten anything for such a long time. The food came out again exactly as it went in. Gregor's body was indeed completely flat and dry. You only really saw it now, that he was no longer lifted up on his little legs, and there was nothing else to draw the eye. "Come in with us for a little while, Greta," said Mrs. Samsa with a sad smile, and Greta went into the bedroom behind her parents, not without looking back at the body. The charwoman shut the door and opened the window wide. In spite of the early hour, there was already a certain mildness mixed into the fresh air. It was, after all, the end of March. The three lodgers came out of their room and looked around in astonishment for their breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle one asked the charwoman sorely. But she put her finger to her lips and then beckoned to the gentleman quickly and silently to come into Gregor's room. They came and stood with their hands in the pockets of their somewhat worn jackets around Gregor's body, in the room that was now quite light. Then the bedroom door opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his livery, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. They had all been crying a little. Greta pressed her face against her father's arm from time to time. "Leave my flat at once," said Mr. Samsa, and pointed to the door without letting go of the women. "What do you mean by that?" said the middle gentleman, somewhat taken aback, and smiled a sugary smile. The other two held their hands behind their backs and rubbed them together continuously, as if in joyful expectation of a great quarrel that was bound to end in their favor. "I mean exactly what I say," answered Mr. Samsa, and advanced in a line with his two companions towards the lodger. At first he stood still and looked at the floor, as if things were arranging themselves into a new order in his head. "Then we shall go," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if, in a sudden fit of humility, he needed fresh permission even for this decision. Mr. Samsa merely nodded at him, briefly several times with wide eyes. At that the gentleman really did go straight into the hall with long strides. His two friends had been listening for a while, with quite still hands, and now they positively hopped after him, as if afraid that Mr. Samsa might get into the hall ahead of them and cut them off from their leader. In the hall, all three took their hats from the rack, drew their sticks from the stand, bowed in silence, and left the flat. In a mistrust that proved to be entirely unfounded, Mr. Samsa stepped out onto the landing with the two women. Leaning on the banister, they watched the three gentlemen going slowly, but steadily down the long stairs, disappearing at each floor at a certain turn of the stairwell, and coming into view again a few moments later. The deeper they went, the more the Samsa family's interest in them faded. And when a butcher's boy came up towards them, and then climbed past high above them with his tray on his head, carrying himself proudly, Mr. Samsa and the women soon left the banister, and they all went back into their flat as if relieved. They decided to spend that day resting and going for a walk. They had not only earned this break from work, they absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 letters of excuse. Mr. Samsa to his management, Mrs. Samsa to the man who gave her work, and Greta to her employer. While they were writing, the charwoman came in to say that she was leaving since her morning work was done. The 3 writers merely nodded at first, without looking up, and only when the charwoman still would not go did they look up in annoyance. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood smiling in the doorway, as if she had some great good fortune to announce to the family, but would only do so if she were thoroughly questioned. The almost upright little ostrich feather on her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa throughout her whole time of service, swayed lightly in every direction. "So what is it you actually want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, for whom the charwoman had the most respect. "Yes," answered the charwoman, and could not go on at once for friendly laughter. "Well, you need not worry about how that thing next door is to be got rid of. It is all taken care of." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent over their letters as if they wanted to go on writing. Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the charwoman was about to start describing everything in detail, firmly waved this off with an outstretched hand. But since she was not allowed to tell her story, she remembered the great hurry she was in, called out, evidently offended, "Goodbye to you all," turned wildly and left the flat with a terrible slamming of doors. "She will be dismissed tonight," said Mr. Samsa, but he got no answer from either his wife or his daughter, because the charwoman seemed to have disturbed the peace they had barely won. They got up, went to the window, and stayed there with their arms around each other. Mr. Samsa turned round in his chair towards them and watched them quietly for a while. Then he called, "Dee, come over here. Let the old business go at last. And have a little consideration for me as well." The women obeyed him at once, hurried over to him, made much of him, and quickly finished their letters. Then all 3 left the flat together, which they had not done for months, and took the tram out to the open country beyond the town. The carriage, in which they sat alone, was filled with warm sunshine. Leaning back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future, and it turned out that, on closer inspection, these were not bad at all, because all 3 of their positions, and they had not really questioned each other about this yet, were extremely favorable and especially promising for later on. The greatest immediate improvement in their situation would of course come easily from moving house. They wanted to take a smaller and cheaper flat, but better situated and altogether more practical than the present one, which Gregor had chosen. While they were talking in this way, it occurred to Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, almost at the same moment, as they looked at their daughter growing ever more lively, that in spite of all the care that had made her cheeks pale, she had lately blossomed into a beautiful and full-figured girl. Growing quieter and understanding each other almost unconsciously through glances, they thought that it would soon be time to find a good husband for her too. And it was like a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when, at the end of their journey, their daughter was the first to get up and stretched her young body.
Thank you for staying with it to the end. I asked you to listen for the sister. She feeds him, she cleans the room, and then she is the one who says out loud that it has to go. Tell me in the comments where you think she crossed that line, and tell me whether you blame her for it.